Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I want to talk about Wi-Fi 7 802.11be. Doesn't sound as cool as AX Wi-Fi, does it? But Wi-Fi 7 is something that is very slowly rolling out at the end of 2023, and indeed 2024 seems to be the main year it's going to be rolling out. And a number of you are looking at all of your network peripherals, your routers, your client devices, your upgrade NICs, all that kind of stuff, and you're thinking about whether to hold out a little bit longer until Wi-Fi 7 is established, or completely ignoring it and jumping on the bandwagon of Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E. Two protocols right now, though very similar, do have their distinctions in terms of performance and bandwidth, but moreover are becoming increasingly affordable. I hate seagulls. And in this video, I'm going to give you 4 reasons why it is worth holding out for Wi-Fi 7 in your home or business environment. But I'm also going to give you 4 reasons why you might want to completely ignore it and make the switch now over to Wi-Fi 6 or 6E, or if you've already got it, sit on that fence a little while longer. Before we go any further though, let's crack on with number 1.
Or visit us on the web at www.
Now, probably the thing that gets the most press when people talk about Wi-Fi 7, and as far as when it was first officially revealed last year at the tail end, it is that Wi-Fi 7 allows your devices, from your routers to your network upgrades to your client devices, your phone in your pocket, to take advantage of the 320 megahertz channel. Now, this video is designed to keep things as chewable and as easy as possible, so I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds. I'm going to translate everything into idiot for me and you. So channels are what your devices are communicating with your router. Frequencies are basically the sandbox. They are all of the radio channels there to play with. But it is those channels there that are the means with which your devices, again, from the phone in your pocket to your wireless device to your TV or whatever, to communicate. But all of these channels, depending on their size, will allow a certain degree of data to be carried in the radio frequencies there, the hertz, the amount of data per hertz, more on that later on. Now, 320 megahertz represents a big old block of that channel for you to be communicating with. That larger channel translates into more data with that single device connected. Now, if you look at Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E, they allow up to 160 megahertz per channel, per connected device. Okay, and you can have a certain number of them across the whole frequency. Remember that whole band, that whole sandbox there for all of the different radio channels. So when you do see a router, you tend to find them, particularly in the degree of Wi-Fi 6 routers, they go AX and then a number. That number is effectively the sheer size of the frequency, but individual devices very rarely are able to take advantage of more than one channel. Now, that single channel in the case of Wi-Fi 7 is twice as big as anything else out there, and that 320 megahertz channel between your device and the router allows you up to 2.4 gigabits of connectivity, or around 240 megabytes of transmission. To put that into perspective, all of these routers here, if you connected them with a standard network connection, a standard wired cable, this gives you 109 megabytes per second. That's right, you have the potential with Wi-Fi 7 to have more than double the connectivity of standard gigabit wired connections there. And again, Wi-Fi 6 had the potential to be better than that, but at 160 megahertz, it capped at 1.2 gigabits or 120 megabytes. So it was only fractionally larger. Wi-Fi 7 allows you to have the larger channels between each of your devices and the routers to have that extra performance to play with, but there's also the advantage in something called 4K QAM. Now, we're not going to go into the details of quadular mechanics here, but long story short, that effectively means that there is more data to be carried over per hertz there. Wi-Fi 7 allows up to 4 times the data per hertz to Wi-Fi 6 and up to 16 times that of Wi-Fi 5 that came before it there. So ultimately, Wi-Fi 7, that is the two main ways in which it presents larger bandwidth between your devices and the router it's connected with, because of that larger channel and the higher capacity of data per hertz made possible.
Or visit us on the web at www.
Next up, another buzzword you must have heard knocking around is MLO, multi-link operation, and it's pretty much what it says on the tin there. It allows devices with MLO support in Wi-Fi 7 to have more than one connection at once. Now, we've already talked about it in wired connections more recently. You hear terms like port trunking, link aggregation, and more recently something called SMB multi-channel. And ultimately, to a lesser or greater degree, depending on the devices that are handling it, that effectively allows you to bond multiple wired connections. MLO, multi-link operation, is effectively, and again this is an oversimplification, it's doing that with wireless connections. It allows your client device and your router to establish multiple connections at once. Now, traditionally you are going to need a client device, a phone, a tablet, a laptop, whatever, and a router both to have MLO support in order to do that. But there have been recent innovations where it is being managed just by the router. And again, that is when things like port trunking and link aggregation in the wired world gave way to SMB multi-channel. That was when the, for example, a NAS or a router you were dealing with was handling and managing multiple connections at once, and your client device didn't need to do that. MLO is a huge breakout advantage over MLO in Wi-Fi 7 is a huge breakout advantage over that of Wi-Fi 6, because although both of them are going to allow these larger density connections, the support of MLO in Wi-Fi 7 is going to allow you to bond multiple Wi-Fi adapters. So, for example, if, for example, you got a wireless adapter for your router that was USB connected and you had more than one, you can have multiple connections, much like you can with a physical connection here on a PC connected system. So if you've got a laptop with 2 USB ports, the minute they start rolling out USB to Wi-Fi 7 adapters, which again will take a while, maybe a year, year and a half, maybe 2, you're able to have one 2.4 gigabits per second connection here, 240 megs per second, and then another one connected to the same system and the same router. That's going to be enormously higher bandwidth than what you're seeing in wired connected devices.
Or visit us on the web at www.
Talking of larger concurrent and simultaneous connected architecture, you may have heard of something called MU-MIMO. Multi-user, multiple input, multiple output. This is something that was pioneered a great deal in the Wi-Fi 6 generation, and this was when you had a larger bandwidth there. The whole area of connectivity between multiple devices in between extended across the one router handling it there. And Wi-Fi 7 brings 16 times 16 MIMO support there. Now that is greater than the 8 times in Wi-Fi 6 compared with this 16 times in Wi-Fi 7. Now, why is that important? That means that that single router can handle more simultaneous high bandwidth connections there. Now, why is that going to be a big deal in terms of people with busy connections? Well, do you remember when I said earlier on that a single connection in Wi-Fi 7 you can go up to 320 megahertz? Well, if, for example, you've got this big old chunky 320 megahertz channel here that you're connected with, that's only going to be useful if your router has sufficient range of the bandwidth there across the frequency to handle lots of those connections. Otherwise, the minute more devices start appearing on this network, the average bandwidth afforded to each device is going to have to shrink in order to fit on more devices there. So you want a router with a larger range. That's why you see lots of routers with about 8 aerials and antennas strapped around the side, or even routers that have got all the antennas inside. When you open them up, they've actually got loads all around. MIMO or MU-MIMO is what is being utilised alongside those multiple antennas to extend the frequency there that can be utilised, the bandwidth on that frequency in all the individual channels. So Wi-Fi 7 introducing 16x16 MIMO is what's going to allow much larger bandwidths to be utilised across the whole frequency, across multiple devices, and each of those individual devices having a larger channel with which to play with.
Or visit us on the web at www.
Now, the final one, again, is going to be something where you're going to need a Wi-Fi 7 device and a Wi-Fi 7 router in order to take advantage of, but puncturing and preamble puncturing, which is what's being discussed now, is what's going to allow Wi-Fi 7 devices to be a lot more economical about the sheer bandwidth and frequency they've got to play with. Now, again, cycling back to that 320 megahertz connection there, if your frequency was this big, like say it was down to here, and you've got a couple of real chunky 320 megahertz channels being utilised by devices, you've got this little area of space here that is going to be used by other devices. But imagine you had a couple of Wi-Fi 6 devices, a couple of Wi-Fi 5 devices there, and one Wi-Fi 7 device. When they're all scattered across this network, you would be forgiven to think that all it's going to do is cram them all together. It doesn't. In reality, frequencies are in bands all the way across each of the breaking from 4 gigahertz into 5 gigahertz into 6 gigahertz, and then partially into the 7 gigahertz spectrum there. Now, before Wi-Fi 7, when a device arrived there, if it didn't fill up this whole band here, for example, between the 5 gigahertz and the 6 gigahertz tier of the frequency, if there was that bit of space left over, this space was wasted. Because unless you had a very low end Wi-Fi 4, Wi-Fi 5 device on like the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, filling that little gap, you lose space on the frequency. Now, that's what preamble puncturing is. Wi-Fi 7 allows you to capitalize on these spaces and allow connections of around 240 and higher frequency connections to live within those spaces, depending on the amount of frequency made available for that band. Now, in reality, what that means is, without Wi-Fi 7, if you'd gone back to Wi-Fi 6 when all the devices could have a maximum 160 megahertz channel connected, you would have 160 there, you'd have 160 next to it, but then you would start crossing some of those individual bands, running the risk that these would be capped off or moved onto a whole new band within the frequency in order to take advantage of it, but you'd still see that wasted space. The idea that Wi-Fi 7 can partially fill these and expand within them allows you to have a better grasp and utilization of the frequency and the bandwidth of that router across multiple devices, and therefore allow more devices to have more bandwidth than they could have had individually prior to Wi-Fi 7. But as good as all that is, and I have really tried to keep this as chewable and user-friendly as possible, as good as those 4 things sound, there is of course the 4 reasons why you might want to completely sack off on Wi-Fi 7 for a few years anyway, or go with Wi-Fi 6 and 6E now. Let's crack on with the reason to hold off number 1. The distance of diminishing returns. I've talked about this before on other videos, and it's something a lot of people don't factor in when they're setting up either a mesh network, which is when you've got multiple little routers all connected together in the background, or if you've got one router that's super powerful in the middle of your home or office. Now, you may have noticed a lot of routers arrive with multiple bands. They'll say multiple frequency bands. They'll say they support 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, and in the case of Wi-Fi 6E, 6 gigahertz. Some of them will have multiple 5 gigahertz if they've got enough antennas there and the MIMO support we mentioned earlier. Now, with all of these bands, if you're in the higher frequency, I should say, if you're in the higher frequency there of 5 gigahertz or 6 gigahertz frequency, you've got a faster speed. However, these have a smaller area of effect. It's really, there's a lot of data being transmitted, and therefore, the further you are, the more opportunity there is for failure. So ultimately, the higher the frequency that you're utilizing, the lower the kind of distance you can get from the router before you're seeing the speeds drop quite significantly. And in most cases, your device, again, your phone, your whatever, will move on to the 2.4 gigahertz frequency there. It will jump down either on its own or be pushed onto it, depending on the complexity and the usability of your router. Now, where Wi-Fi 7 comes into this, Wi-Fi 7 doesn't really take advantage of much more at the moment in terms of frequency. It doesn't. It's still largely living in the same area of space, give or take, as Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 6E, I should say. Now, the 6 gigahertz frequency there has that smaller coverage physically than the 5 gigahertz frequency, and obviously a great deal less than the 2.4 gigahertz. So in order to take advantage of the true benefits of Wi-Fi 7 and really take advantage of the frequency with those large, chunky 320 megahertz connections, you're going to have to be relatively closer to the router, because the minute you get too far away, you'll be able to enjoy it in the 5 and 6 gigahertz bands. But the minute you get even moderately far away, you're going to be moved over to the 2.4 gigahertz frequency, where there isn't a huge amount of bandwidth, at least on the radio frequency, to establish these big, chunky Wi-Fi 7 connections. And the result is going to be that Wi-Fi 7, for all of its high promises, is still going to be a distance game, much like Wi-Fi 6 and 6E before it, but I would argue on a larger scale, because the big promises of Wi-Fi 7 and those larger 320 megahertz channels aren't going to be enjoyable on the smaller frequencies in the way that they are on Wi-Fi 6 and 6E on the 160 megahertz channels that you're establishing there. Now, this is when we bring into question things like this, where instead of going for the wireless connection, you can get 2.5 gigabit with a USB adapter. This thing's like 20 nicker, 15 in some places, and it allows you to create a wired connection between a USB connected device at 2.5 gigabits. That's faster than Wi-Fi 7, and with the advantage that the Ethernet cable can go at about 20 to 100 meters. Obviously, there will be a deterioration after that 20 to 50 meters line, but still nonetheless, that's a huge amount of performance with a 20 quid adapter there without having to replace all of your wireless connected devices. And these are available right now. Then you can factor in things like power line adapters that will allow you, if the router's in one end of your house, to use the mains power connection in your home. And there should be a video link below to my guide on power line adapters, that rather than using wired connections, you can just run a connection, a physical wire from your router into a mains power outlet, into a power line adapter. You take another power line adapter somewhere else in your home and remove the wire coming out of that. And power line adapters have come forward exponentially in recent years, and you can really make a saving and ultimately have a much more fluid, strong connection from a further distance than you can in Wi-Fi 6 and indeed Wi-Fi 7. Of course, cost. That was always going to be a big one, wasn't it? The cost of Wi-Fi 7 at launch is going to be a joke. And we don't even need to postulate, because as little as a month and a half ago, we started to see brands like TP-Link actually release their routers. We've seen them reviewed in a few places online. Again, hats off to Dong Knows Tech. Check him out. He did a review of the BE800 along with a few other people, and this is from TP-Link, and it's a $600 router. Now, yeah, it's new. Yeah, you can take advantage of the higher bandwidth, but $600 for a router is insanity, particularly when there aren't a lot of Wi-Fi 7 devices out there and you are paying for your future proofing, when you're going to have to wait for adapters, wait for client devices to arrive with Wi-Fi 7. More on that later on. Now, what we're seeing with the first kind of generation of Wi-Fi 7 routers is, in order to justify the price, we're seeing these Wi-Fi routers like the BE800 roll out with Wi-Fi 7 and this enormous amount of bandwidth potential. I think it's like 9,000, might be 11,000 AX or something. Not AX, BE. But at the same time, they're rolling out for with a couple of 10G wired Ethernet ports, 10G ports, and 4 2.5 gig ports on there. So on the one hand, physical bandwidth on this is 25 gigabit Ethernet across 25 GBE to play with, not 25, 30 GBE even, 10, 2.5 times 4, terrible maths there. And as good as that sounds, you're buying this router for the Wi-Fi 7. As good as it is for this $600 router to roll in with a couple of 10Gs and 4 2.5Gs, that seems that they're just bumping up the price to sort of justify that 600 nicker price tag. When you bought that for Wi-Fi 6E, if you wanted to go for 10G and 2.5 gig ports, you can get switches and get particularly high performance routers right now with Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E for about 200 to 300 nicker with greater density of that wired connection, but at the same time Wi-Fi 6 and 6E. So, and they're ones you can use right now with client devices. I haven't even touched on the fact that you can get Wi-Fi 6E USB adapters. This is an 18 on average dollar upgrade here for USB. We've done a video on it that allows you to have Wi-Fi 6E onto your system. You're going to save an absolute packet. So spending 600 nicker on a Wi-Fi 7 router when you can't take advantage of most of the features and advantages of Wi-Fi 7 right now, when you could go out and buy a 3-pack such as the Google Nest Pro, for example, which is the Wi-Fi 6E 3-node mesh system for about 350 nicker, then chuck on a bunch of 2.5 gig adapters. Again, they're $15 to $20 each. Chuck on some of those Wi-Fi 6E adapters there if you want to. There's huge advantages there, and at 600 nicker, you could fully spec out about 4 to 6 devices on Wi-Fi 6E and have a Wi-Fi 6 network for the cost of that one Wi-Fi 7 router that you can't even take advantage of the full abilities of. And something we touched on earlier, client adoption. Right now, Wi-Fi 7, you're not going to see realistic client hardware adoption. Again, client hardware is your tablets, your phones, your whatever. You're not going to see anything like global adoption or even moderate consumer grade client adoption for about 18 to 24 months. You're going to see slowly but surely your TP-Links, your D-Links, your Netgears, your etc. rolling out routers with Wi-Fi 7. But when it comes to the devices you're actually using, they're not going to have Wi-Fi 7 for a long time, and therefore you're not going to be able to take advantage of that 320 megahertz channel there between your devices. You're not going to be able to take advantage of MLO to bond a lot of those connections together, or the puncturing advantages between the bandwidth. But if you go for Wi-Fi 6 or 6E at the moment, not only are we seeing more and more phones, we're seeing second and third generation Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E client hardware. We're seeing Amazon Fire Sticks arriving with 6E. We're seeing Google adopting their router system with 6E, along with a lot of their tablets and a lot of their phones arriving with 6E. We're seeing iPhones arriving with 6E. We're seeing consoles arrive with Wi-Fi 6. The PS5 is Wi-Fi 6. We're seeing adapters arriving on the scene with 2.5 and 5 gig connectivity there, Wi-Fi 6 USB adapters. We're seeing those 6E adapters. We're seeing client adoption on devices. We're seeing client upgrades, and routers arrive affordably and in larger number in Wi-Fi 6 and 6E right now, and it's going to be a long time before the winds of change go towards Wi-Fi 7. So if you go for Wi-Fi 7, just know that most of your clients, either out the box or via an upgrade, are not going to give you Wi-Fi 7 for a very long time. And the last thing we need to talk about is the fact that right now, when it comes to the frequency, remember that radio frequency, the sandbox with which all of these connections are going to live within, well, we're starting to see limited frequencies in between that whole range start to become available. What does that mean? Well, you may not be aware, but across radio frequencies, whenever we talk about it, there's a reason we never talk about the 1 and 2 gigahertz frequencies across the whole connections. The reason being that a lot of these are reserved, some of them for the police, for emergency services, for logistical reasons and more, and military concerns as well. But as wireless connectivity and wireless devices become more vogue and popular, and the utilization of some of those frequencies has depreciated so rapidly, we're starting to see authorization rollout of those more limited frequencies become available, and by doing so allowing those older generation 6 and 6E devices to have more room to play with, thereby undermining the necessity for some users across the bandwidth of Wi-Fi 7. Now, a great example, and something we talked about before, is with this device here. This is the RT6600AX from Synology, and they also rolled out the WiFiAX router as well. Why is this significant? They were among some of the first routers to arrive commercially that had access to the 5.9 gigahertz frequency. That was when, at the 5 gigahertz frequency and then eventually the 6 gigahertz frequency for Wi-Fi 6, there was this chunky space not in use. But we're seeing more devices roll out that support the 5.9 gigahertz frequency, and by doing so, that allows more of those simultaneous 160 megahertz connections to be utilized. It won't allow your Wi-Fi 6 device to get more speed. It's still going to be 1.2 gigabits per second, with the exception if you're using convoluted dual band adapters. But that extra frequency opened up with things like the 5.9 gigahertz unlocking that used to be used for transport, but now it's being utilized by more devices, has allowed more simultaneous devices to take advantage of 1.2 gigabits per second connections. And if you were never going to have the full 2.4 gigabits per second connection of Wi-Fi 7 open to you, this might be the reason that opting for Wi-Fi 6 or 6E becomes more desirable for you. Because although you're not going to have one device being even faster, you can have more devices having that 1.2 gigabits per second enjoyed across the whole frequency there. But this has been 4 reasons why you should hold out and wait for Wi-Fi 7, and 4 reasons why you should sack that off and stick with the Wi-Fi 6 or 6E, or grab yourself a bargain today. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I have tried my damnedest to make this video as chewable and user-friendly as possible. But this is a very convoluted subject, and one that is very difficult to explain without launching into hyperbole or using quite jargonistic terms. So I apologise in advance if I didn't really succeed in my mission to keep this as user-friendly as possible. Hopefully I did, but let me know if I did or I didn't in the comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Take advantage of the free advice over on NAS Compares, big blue button on the right hand side. You can use our Ko-Fi or Patreon to get more direct means to get in contact with us or sign up for exclusive content. Use the free community forum or our Discord, and of course there'll be links in the description to other videos we've done on networking, wireless and indeed Wi-Fi 7, as well as links to products we may have discussed today. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.